Freefall is a group of works that have happened over the last few years, really starting just before the pandemic struck, and then continuing right through. You know, I mean, when COVID struck, I think most of us thought we had a week or two, and then reality there'd be a check, and we would go back to living the lives that we were all so accustomed and used to. And things never went back. Before I knew it, I had my son homeschooling in my studio, and I'll never forget that first homeschooling event in my studio where he was on the screen in front of his whole class of 30, 14-year-olds and a teacher. And in her introduction, and I wanted to watch this first Zoom school class in the history of our country. And halfway through the introduction, the teacher got very emotional and lost it. And Joe looked at me and said, "What? I don't understand." And I completely got it. It was a momentous occasion, very harrowing time for school staff, for school teachers, and for their parents. For a 14-year-old, you just ride that wave pretty quickly. And I don't think most of those 14, 15, now 16-year-olds realise what they've missed out on. Basically, the whole of Year 9 and Year 10 was done either behind a mask and separated, or in front of a computer screen on Zoom. And it was just such fertile and confronting material to make paintings about. So I started working on a series of works which were all about the human body and the human form, and some still life as well, trying to sort of turn the human form into a still life. Big notions of, you know, playing with the ideas around the end of humanity, the destruction of the community as we know it, which finally led into the latest series of works, which are about those human bodies getting back off the table and going to war, in a sense. I think partly about the way, I think on a interpersonal level between people, one-on-one, a lot of us seem to be losing the ability to do that with sophistication or compassion. And then it's reflected so broadly and so grotesquely in our politics, in Australian politics, in Western politics, in what's happening now in the Ukraine, between all these different parts of the world. This posturing, shirt fronting, as Tony Abbott so aptly called it, it just felt to me like I needed to make some paintings that were really directly about this collision of our own humanity, rubbing up against each other in the wrong way, when that's really the last thing we need right now, I feel. Richard Flanagan did give me the title, Freefall. He's quite smart, and I asked him one morning, I'm having real troubles about coming up for a title for a bronze work, a figure of a man, almost the world inverted on his shoulders, but his face planting into the ground, his head's buried in the sand, and it's an inversion of all of the, you know, the heroic conquering British explorers that found Australia and conquered most of the world, and held slaves in a lot of parts of Northern America, and stole people from all over the planet back in the day. And I just couldn't come up with an apt title for the work. It's a huge process to go through that bronze, from the figure, from a scan of the man, who is a very good friend of mine. He's a retired policeman who's suffering from the trauma, post-traumatic stress disorder of managing crime scenes for 25 years. And he's just a lovely human who was very open to the idea of me using his body to tell a story about this sort of inversion of masculinity. Almost, I guess, my response, in a sense, quite directly to the John Batman statue in Melbourne. John Batman being the founder of Melbourne, but also a man who was who was exiled from Tasmania, and the governor of Tasmania at the time was quoted as saying that Batman has much slaughter to account for, and he went to the mainland and founded Melbourne. And there's an upright statue of him in a suburb of Melbourne, and I thought, this is my response to that. And I was just literally having my morning coffee, and often Richard and I talk early in the morning when he's having a break from writing and I'm continuing to procrastinate from my own practice. And I showed him an image, and he instantly said, it feels like free fall to me, even though, I mean, it's a lovely title because it's actually this figure slamming hard into the earth. So yeah, that's where it came from. And that became the title for the whole book. Thanks to Flann. Thanks, Richard. Why does violence hold such a particular place in art is a really, really good question. I remember reading a quote from, and I've forgotten his name now, a writer around the time of Picasso, saying that artists make their best work when they have something to respond to. In other words, they have something very extreme happening in their community, and often that's war. Guernica, for example, and Picasso's, arguably greatest work. I think now, because of the globalization, the digital globalization of the world, every artist on the face of the planet is facing the same crisis. Every single human on the face of the earth is now facing a crisis beyond our imagining 25 years ago. And while this crisis of the environment is bearing down on us, feels to me like the community is accelerating into these notions of violence. I mean, George Bellows is the starting point for a whole series of work in the Freefall book. American, I think he's sort of the Arthur Streeton of America at the time, brilliant painter of the everyday life, particularly in New York. And he went into the underground boxing rings of New York at the time. The New York State had banned boxing and had basically forewarned that boxing tended a community towards a much more violent future than what the men ruling the country at that time imagined. And now for those people, and for George Bellows to realise that UFC is now the most celebrated and watched sporting event on the planet, we failed at trying to keep, starting in New York State, failed at trying to keep violence out of our communities. And now you look at the games that kids play. I mean, there's video games. I have my son's 15-year-old friends who play R-rated video games, grotesque, unbelievable violence, and going into these worlds of imagination of celebrating hurting other people. And it's no wonder now that Ukraine's teetering on the edge, and that so many countries in the world seem to be teetering on the edge of these violent, explosive pieces of contemporary history. And it comes down to us too. I think the violence in the narrative in our own parliament in Australia is revolting. We like to tell our children in primary school that you do not yell at other children, and that you treat each other with respect. You treat each other the way you would hope to be treated. You forgive and you apologise. And all of those rules are absolutely ignored in the highest chamber of our political system, in the Parliament of Canberra. And I think it's revolting. Those people do not lead by, they are not leading a way forward for the youth of our community to adhere to a peaceful and sociable community. The reason I focused on the reason the UFC came into such focus for me through the last part of this body of work really started with George Bellows and his very poignant paintings, and one particularly called Both Members of This Club, an African-American fighting a white Irish-American in a very dark space, both meeting on a level ground, on a level playing field, and both respected in the same sense. But nonetheless, still he's making works that are pretty grotesque, in underground, hidden, illegal boxing rings. And I was so taken with these paintings. They're so beautiful, they're so powerful, they're so confronting. There's such a beautiful critique of contemporary society in 1910 in New York. And I suddenly, it struck me, imagine what George Bellows would think now about what's happening to American society, to UFC fighting in New York State. The fact that boxing was illegal in New York in 1910, and now UFC is America's greatest sporting export in the history of America. The most violent sport, arguably since Roman times. It says a lot of very dark things, I think, about our community that we live in. I'm always interested in the response, obviously, an audience response, less so critics. The more older I get, the more I am pretty focused on what I need to do, and possibly paid too much time listening to negative and positive criticism when I was a bit younger. No, the audience, I think, has on the whole been a bit shocked. It feels the violence, I think, is pretty hard to come to sometimes, but people are used to that from me, and it's an important thing to talk about. And if you can do it beautifully with beautiful, I mean, color paint is the best tool to tell dark stories with, because dark purple or darkness of a bruise, or the dark green of bile after a week, they are really beautiful colors when you squeeze them out of a tube and mix them with linseed oil and put them on a surface. So there's this sense of it's very alluring, and then you can tell very dark stories. I think people have been a bit shocked by how confronting some of them are. They're not pretty paintings, but I'm not known for many pretty paintings. I should say the other reason I was so determined that this work should be in a book is that one of these shows was in Melbourne. It was open for less than 48 hours. It opened for a day and a bit, and then Melbourne locked down. And the other show was similarly not seen in Brisbane. So it's a huge amount of work over several years that was just not seen. I thought probably now's the time to put these works together into a book. And that's such a response to my sense of how the world has behaved through a pandemic. How have we adjusted? How have we behaved? How have we misbehaved? I think it's an interesting thing to make a book in this sense. It's almost 3 bodies of work catalogued as one object. My last big book was a huge production and was over as 25 years of my work. And that was really hard because things had to be picked apart and series had to be pulled apart to fit into the book. Whereas this really is just 3 years of work, almost one after the other. Not every single work, but all the key works through that period. And so in that sense, it's a much easier thing. But being an artist, the way we work, an exhibition is shown, this is across 3 shows, one show in Brisbane, the next show in Melbourne, and the final show was in London. So I don't think anyone saw all 3 of those shows. I didn't see any of them in the flesh in the gallery space. So to have all those 3 shows together like this, 3 commercial shows, none of them are museum shows, but they're shows that nonetheless that are really a core part of my practice. I think it's really interesting. It's not the way most artists work. We're not given that opportunity to show 3 or 4 shows from our general practice in a row in one book, and it's I think it's really exciting. It shows the evolution very clearly from beginning to end. I think every artist hopes that one day there's groups of works that will come back together. Whether it does, or I might be dead by then, I don't know. I don't know. It's really interesting to consider it. There are works here that make very much sense together. And I hope to make more books. I love books. I mean, mostly I'm reading books, looking at art books, although I do obviously look at art books. I just got a George Condo book in the post from London that just blew my mind for a week. Plus, I'm a reader. I'm always reading something. So books are part of my life, that's for sure. And I hope that this book just is the beginning of more books. This book's drawn from starting with George Bellows, my cousin Andrew Quilty's photos of Cronulla, models, young men and women lying as though they died in my studio. It's crossed all sorts of experiences of my own life. And violence was a really confrontingly inherent part of my youth, actually. Lots of fights, lots of violence. I had friends really severely injured, and really that violence when I was 18 and 19 is what really brought me to the point of examining masculinity right through my practice. That's the one constant in the work that I've made over the last 25, 30 years. But through this show, I said earlier, I have stopped listening to critics, and that's not just listening to critics in the media and in art magazines and in newspapers. It's also listening to myself, my criticism of myself. And to make art, you have to, I've said before, be very, very self-critical and unbelievably egotistical and swamped with self-belief. And it's when those two things collide and you're willing to destroy something that you're proud of and taking that to very sort of psychotic extremities, I guess, that in the middle of that comes good art. And through the last 2 or 3 years, and not really because of the work, actually because of the pandemic and the way we have to live now, I really started to find ways to get rid of that self-doubting voice, to stop worrying about not necessarily what the audience thinks, but that self-critical part of my own mind, which I think's been there ever since I was a little kid, just to make and to openly and as fluently as I can talk to an audience about what is happening in my world and theirs.